The ceremonial hall of Velhari Prime's royal palace had been designed, according to the architectural records Ethan had read during his first week of orientation, to make everyone inside it feel appropriately small. It succeeded. The columns alone were 40 meters high, carved from a stone the Velhari called *sorvith, a dark, almost black material that had the unsettling quality of appearing to absorb light rather than reflect it, so that the hall always existed in a kind of atmospheric dusk, regardless of how many of the overhead emitters were running. Ethan had mentioned this to his bunkmate, Corporal Reyes, during their second week on assignment. Reyes had looked up at the columns, then down at his boots, then said that his apartment back in New Cascadia also absorbed light, and it just meant the bulbs needed changing. Ethan had decided Reyes was not a man burdened by the poetic. That had been 18 months ago. Ethan knew the hall differently now. He knew that the third column from the eastern entrance had a stress fracture running 6 meters up its base that the palace engineers had been arguing about for 2 years without fixing. He knew that the atmospheric regulators, the slim silver units mounted at intervals along the upper gallery, responsible for maintaining the precise 19.4 degrees Celsius that Queen Selivra apparently required for formal occasions, made a faint cycling sound every 4 minutes that you could only hear if you had been standing in the same position long enough to stop hearing everything else. He knew that the floor, which looked like polished stone, was actually a composite material with thermal properties, and that it was marginally warmer near the center of the room, where the ceremonial space was marked by a circle of inlaid pale metal. He knew all of this because his job, stated plainly, was to stand at the edge of rooms and pay attention, and Ethan Vale was, if nothing else, very good at standing still and paying attention. The court had been assembling for 40 minutes. The Velhari nobles came in their formal configurations, family groupings arranged by seniority, each member wearing the silver ear threading that indicated rank, the delicate metalwork catching what light the *sorvith columns hadn't yet consumed. Their ears, long and tapered to fine points, were the most immediate visual difference from the human staff, though after 18 months Ethan had stopped registering it the way he once had. In the early weeks he had caught himself staring. He had corrected this. It was the kind of correction that felt like professionalism but was probably just basic courtesy, and he had made it quietly and without ceremony, the way he made most adjustments. The human contingent occupied their designated section near the eastern wall, 12 diplomatic staff, 4 cultural attachés, and 6 members of the joint security detail including Ethan, all of them standing with the particular posture of people who had been briefed extensively on the importance of not embarrassing the accord. Ambassador Harlow had delivered that briefing personally, 3 days ago, in the specific tone she reserved for situations where she believed her audience required the information, but resented needing to give it. "You are guests," she had said, standing at the head of the briefing room with her hands clasped at the small of her back. "You are observers. You will observe quietly, you will react to nothing, and you will under no circumstances do anything that could be interpreted as," she had paused, searching, "human." Reyes had raised his hand and asked if breathing counted. Harlow had looked at him for a long moment and then continued as though he hadn't spoken, which was, Ethan reflected, probably the correct response. Above the main floor, accessed by 2 curved staircases that swept upward from the hall's northern end, the gallery ran the length of the room. It was there that the princess had been positioned with her attendants, 3 of them, in the pale gray robes that marked household staff of the inner court, standing in a precise arrangement that placed Kyra at the center and slightly back from the gallery railing. Ethan had noted her when he took his position. She was 6 years old and she had her mother's black hair and her father's, the late consort's, according to the records, a tendency toward expressive stillness, which meant that she stood quietly in ways that nonetheless communicated considerable internal activity. She had spotted Ethan from the gallery, as she usually did, and raised one hand in a wave that was small enough to be deniable if an attendant noticed it. He had returned it with a nod that was equally deniable. It was their established protocol. He had not planned to have an established protocol with the 6-year-old heir to the Velhari throne, but children, in his experience, did not consult your plans. The hall fell quiet in the specific way. It only fell quiet when Queen Selevra entered. She came from the northern archway, alone, wearing the formal blacks of the demonstration, not armor exactly, but something that carried the memory of armor in the way it moved with her, structured at the shoulders and through the torso, fitted in a way that suggested function had been the original consideration and appearance had simply agreed. Her black hair was pulled back with the precision of someone for whom appearance was a form of discipline. Her skin had the particular pale quality that looked almost luminous against the dark fabric, and she moved across the ceremonial floor with the even, unhurried pace of a person who had never once needed to rush toward anything because things had always arranged themselves to wait for her. She was, Ethan thought, with the detached accuracy of someone cataloging a fact, genuinely extraordinary to watch. He also thought this in the same mental register he used to note the stress fracture in the third column, as information, filed appropriately, used for nothing. The court performed its reverence in the Velhari fashion, a lowering of the eyes accompanied by a slight turn of the head, exposing the ear, which apparently carried symbolic weight he had never fully decoded. The human staff produced a coordinated bow that Ambassador Harlow had rehearsed them on twice. Reyes, beside him, executed it with the focused expression of a man diffusing something. Selevra took her position at the center of the pale circle. An attendant appeared from the left, presented a flat case, opened it. The ceremonial blade caught the hall's muted light, and for a moment seemed to be the only sharp thing in the room. She took it without looking at it, which is how you hold something you have held 10,000 times, and turned to face the assembled court. She began. The forms were called *Verath. Ethan had looked this up, and they were not combat in any practical modern sense, but rather a codified preservation of Velhari martial history, each sequence corresponding to a dynasty, each movement carrying a name and a meaning that court scholars spent careers interpreting. Watching Selevra move through them was watching something that existed at the precise intersection of violence and architecture. The blade described arcs that seemed geometrically inevitable. Her footwork left no wasted motion. The court watched with the silent attention of people in the presence of something they considered sacred. Then, from the gallery above, came the sound of small shoes hitting marble at speed. One of the attendants said something sharp in Velhari. A second voice, higher, faster, said something back. Ethan was already looking up when Kyra appeared at the top of the eastern staircase, both hands gripping the railing, her face wearing the specific expression of a child who has made a decision and is now committed to its consequences. She came down the stairs at a run. She crossed the lower hall floor at a run. She was heading with complete and unerring intention directly toward Ethan. He caught her without thinking about it. That was the honest account of what happened. Not a decision, not a calculation, just the automatic response of someone whose body had processed *small person, moving fast toward me before his mind had finished processing everything else in the room. He went down to one knee on the composite floor, which was warmer than it looked, and Kyra arrived against his shoulder with the full commitment of someone who had been running toward a specific destination and had now reached it. Her arms went around his neck. Her face went into the space between his jaw and his collar. She did not make a sound, which was somehow worse than if she had. The hall was absolutely silent. Ethan was aware of the silence the way you are aware of pressure. It had weight, it had direction, and it was coming from approximately 60 Velhari nobles and 12 human diplomatic staff, all of whom were either staring at him or working very hard at not staring at him. He was also aware, in his peripheral vision, of Queen Selevra standing at the center of the pale circle with her blade still raised, which meant that the tableau currently being presented to the assembled court of Velhari Prime was. Their sovereign, mid-form, blade elevated, looking across the ceremonial floor at a human guard kneeling at the edge of the room with the heir to the throne attached to his neck. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him given the circumstances, that Ambassador Harlow was going to have a very specific tone at the next briefing. Kyra's grip tightened slightly. He adjusted his balance without moving his feet and brought one hand up to rest at her back, lightly, the way you hold something that has frightened itself. Above the gallery railing, the three attendants in gray robes had materialized in a cluster, looking down with expressions that moved fluidly between professional horror and the helpless paralysis of people who have failed at the one task they were assigned. The nearest one, a woman whose ear-threading indicated some seniority, was doing something with her hands that might have been a formalized gesture of apology directed at the Queen, or possibly a formal gesture of resignation. Ethan did not know enough Velhari court language to distinguish between the two, and suspected this was not the moment to ask. He heard Celevra move. The sound of it was specific, the particular compression of the composite floor under someone who controlled exactly how much weight they committed to each step. She crossed from the center circle toward him at a pace that was not hurrying, because she was not a person who hurried, which meant it was also not slow, because she was not a person who wasted time. He had approximately 12 steps before she reached him, which he spent neither fleeing nor explaining, because he had no exit and no explanation. And so he simply remained where he was with the princess of the Velhari attached to him and waited. Celevra stopped 3 meters away. Up close, the ceremonial blade was more detailed than it appeared from across the room. The edge carried a faint luminescence that he understood was a material property of the metal and not, or probably not, an active energy state. She held it with the same absence of thought as before. She looked at him, and then at Kyra, and then at the place where they connected, and her face did the thing Ethan had spent 18 months learning to read. It produced nothing. This was not the same as feeling nothing. He had learned that distinction carefully. Then Kyra, face still pressed to his collar, said, in a voice that was small but entirely audible in the silent hall, "I got scared." No one moved. "The blade went up," Kyra continued, with the matter-of-fact precision of a child explaining a completely logical sequence of events. "And it was very big and I got scared, so I came to find Ethan." Somewhere to Ethan's left, in the human diplomatic section, he heard a sound that Ray's converted, with admirable speed, into a cough. Ethan decided that when this was over, he was going to say something sincere to Ray's about that cough. It deserved recognition. Celevra's eyes moved from her daughter to Ethan. He met them, because looking away seemed worse, and said, quietly and with the care of someone choosing every word like they were stepping across uncertain ground, "The princess became frightened and came to find me, Your Majesty. I hope that was all right." He paused. "She arrived very quickly." He heard from the noble section a sound that he would later describe to Ray's as the noise 60 people make when they are all deciding simultaneously not to have an opinion. It was remarkable. He had not known that sound existed before tonight. Celevra looked at him for a moment that had more interior dimensions than its length suggested. Then she looked at Kyra. Something moved across her face, fast, contained, gone before he could fully read it, but present long enough that he knew it had been there. "Kyra," she said. Her voice was the same in this register as it was in the formal register. Even precise, the voice of someone for whom modulation was a skill that had been refined past the point of effort. Kyra's arms, if anything, tightened slightly. "Kyra," Celevra said again, and this time there was something in the second syllable that was marginally different from the first. Not softer exactly, more like something that had considered being softer and was still in the process of deciding. "Come here." Kyra turned her head just enough to look at her mother from the shelter of Ethan's shoulder. With one eye, in the manner of a small animal assessing whether a situation had changed sufficiently to warrant re-engagement. It had apparently not. "Don't want to," she said. The diplomatic section produced a silence so concentrated it was nearly a physical object. Ethan looked straight ahead at a point slightly above Selivra's left ear and thought about his contractual obligations. He had a 3-year posting agreement. He was 14 months in. He thought about whether there was a clause covering this specific situation, and concluded, with some confidence, that there was not, because no one who had written the joint security accord between humanity and the Velhari had apparently considered that this was a thing that could happen. Selivra lowered the blade. It was a small movement, but it changed the room. Something in the assembled court released fractionally, like a collective breath held too long. She regarded her daughter for a moment with the expression of a general reconsidering the terrain. Then she looked at Ethan again, and he had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling of being read the way he usually read rooms. "We will speak this evening," she said. It was not a question. It was not precisely a command either, though it had all of a command's structural properties. It existed in a register that Ethan suspected was reserved for situations the Velhari had not built a formal word for yet. "Yes, Your Majesty," he said. She held his gaze for one beat longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned with the same even, unhurried pace and walked back toward the center of the room. The court rearranged itself around her movement. An attendant materialized to receive the blade. The atmospheric regulators cycled through their 4-minute rotation, producing their small, indifferent sound. Kyra, still attached to Ethan's shoulder, let out a breath that had apparently been waiting a while. "Is she angry?" she whispered. Ethan, who had 18 months of data on this exact question, thought about it honestly. "I think," he said carefully, "she is something more complicated than angry." Kyra considered this. "Is that worse?" He looked across the room to where Selivra had resumed her position. Blade returned to her hand, the demonstration apparently continuing as though the last 4 minutes had been a scheduled intermission. "I'll let you know," he said. The receiving room they put him in had a window that looked out over the palace's western court, where the Velhari kept a garden of bioluminescent plants that pulsed faintly in the dark in shades of blue and pale green. Ethan had been in this room twice before, once for a security debrief after a perimeter irregularity that turned out to be a malfunctioning sensor, and once by accident, having taken a wrong turn in a corridor system that the palace's internal navigation unit described as intuitively structured, which was the kind of phrase that meant whoever designed it had never actually needed to find anything. Both times the room had been empty and functional. Tonight it had been arranged, 2 chairs set at an angle to each other, a low table with a carafe of something that steamed faintly, and the particular quality of lighting that the Velhari used when a space was meant to signal that a conversation was private but not adversarial. He had learned to read Velhari spatial language the way you learn any language, through repeated exposure and a series of mistakes you tried not to repeat. He had been waiting 11 minutes when Selivra arrived. She came without attendance, which he had expected based on the room's arrangement. She had changed from the formal blacks of the demonstration into something that still carried authority in every line, but had released the ceremonial weight of the earlier garment, darker still, fitted, but without the structured shoulders that had made her look, he had thought privately, like a very elegant threat. Her hair was still pulled back. It appeared to be a permanent condition rather than a stylistic choice. He rose when she entered. She looked at him with an expression that indicated she had noticed this and had noted it as information without deciding yet what to do with it. And then she sat, and he sat, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The carafe, he noticed, was producing a steam that carried a faint scent, something botanical that wasn't quite any plant he knew, which meant it was probably native to Velhari Prime's northern continent, where most of the things that didn't have Earth equivalents came from. He thought about mentioning this and then thought better of it. He was here because the Queen had told him they would speak, and he had learned, over 18 months, that in Velhari formal culture the person who spoke first in a private meeting was, symbolically, the one making a request. He was not certain this was a formal meeting. He was also not certain it wasn't. He sat with his hands resting on his knees and waited. Selivra said, "What do you think it meant?" It was not quite a question, delivered in the tone she apparently reserved for things she already had a theory about and wanted tested. Ethan recognized the structure because he had heard Ambassador Harlow use the same construction, and he had learned with Harlow that the correct response was not to give her the answer she expected, but to give her the accurate one and let the discrepancy do its own work. "I think," he said, taking the same care with the words as he had on the hall floor, "that children sort people into categories. Not consciously. They just file people according to how those people make them feel, and the filing system is very simple and very honest, and it doesn't care about rank or protocol or what the correct behavior is." He paused. "The princess has filed me under something that meant when she was frightened, she ran toward me, which means she's filed something else under a different category." Selivra was quiet for a moment. Outside, the bioluminescent garden pulsed through its slow cycle, blue deepening briefly to something closer to violet before easing back. "You are describing the category she has put me in," Selivra said. "I'm describing what her running suggested about it," Ethan said. "I don't know what's in the category. I'm not sure it matters what's in it exactly. What matters is what label is on the outside." She looked at him with the expression he was beginning to think of as her reading expression, the one that processed information without advertising the processing. Then she reached forward and poured from the carafe into one of the 2 cups on the table and set it in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. He decided this was a gesture he would think about later and drank, and it tasted like something between tea and a mild electrical suggestion, which was normal for Velhari botanical preparations, and which he had made his peace with around month 4. "I have led 2 military campaigns," Selivra said. "I have negotiated the Hareth Accords, which took 11 months and nearly collapsed 4 times. I survived a formal challenge to my sovereignty at 29, which required me to fight a man who outweighed me by 40 kilograms in front of my entire court." She paused. "I am apparently undone by a child in running shoes." Ethan looked at his cup. "For what it's worth," he said, "she is very fast. The running shoes may be doing real work." The sound that came from Selivra then was small and brief, and apparently surprised her as much as it did him. Not quite a laugh, more like the first syllable of one, caught and released before it could become a thing that had happened. She looked at him as though assessing whether he had heard it. He had heard it. He made no record of hearing it. "In 18 months of assignment here," he said, "I have been sneezed on, drawn on with what I believe was a permanent marking stylus, and once used as a hiding place during a game I didn't know I was playing for approximately 20 minutes before anyone told me." He considered. "My orientation materials did not cover any of that." "No," Selivra said, and there was something drier in her voice now, something that had decided provisionally to be less guarded. "I imagine they didn't." The garden outside pulsed again. One of the atmospheric regulators in the corner of the room began its cycling hum, 4 minutes having apparently elapsed. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said, and waited, because asking permission was the correct architecture for this particular question. She made a small gesture with one hand that meant proceed in Velhari spatial language. He had looked that one up specifically. "When did you last spend time with her without the blade being part of the context?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. Selivra did not answer immediately, which told him something. She looked past him toward the window, and for a moment her face did something that wasn't quite the reading expression and wasn't quite anything else he had a name for, something that had come up from a deeper register than the ones she usually operated in during conversations with human palace staff. "She attends formal functions," Selivra said finally. "She is present for court ceremonies. The demonstration today was," she stopped, started again with the precision of someone correcting their own navigation in real time. I lifted the blade today in front of my daughter without once considering what the blade looks like to someone who doesn't know what the ceremony is, who only knows that her mother is holding something sharp and moving toward the center of a room full of people. She's 6, Ethan said, not as a correction, as a calibration. She is 6, Selivra said, and the repetition of it carried weight that the original statement hadn't, as though hearing it in her own voice in this room without the architecture of the court around it made it a different piece of information. She has attendants, she has tutors, she has a schedule built around her safety and her education and her preparation for what she will eventually need to be. She paused. She apparently does not have. And here she stopped again, not for lack of words, but as though the word she needed was one she didn't want to use because using it would make its absence a thing that had been formally named. Someone who sits on the floor, Ethan said quietly. Selivra looked at him. Not a metaphor, he said. Literally. Someone who gets down to her level and stays there. It's a small thing. Children notice it more than most other things. The room was quiet for a moment. The carafe steamed. The garden pulsed. You are, Selivra said, with the measured tone of someone making an assessment they hadn't anticipated making, not what I expected from a joint security posting. I get that a lot, Ethan said, mostly from Reyes. She looked at him with something that was almost a question. My bunkmate, he said. He's deeply unimpressed by most things. It's actually a very stabilizing quality in a person. Selivra was quiet for a moment. Then, the fact that you are sitting in this room, having this conversation with me, is noted. He understood that this was not a compliment exactly. It was something more structural than a compliment, a recognition that a thing existed, offered by someone for whom recognition was its own significant currency. The fact that you called me here to have it, he said carefully, is also noted. Outside, the garden shifted from violet back to blue. The receiving room held its careful light around them both, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which felt, to Ethan, less like silence and more like the end of a first sentence that had taken the whole evening to finish. Ethan did not sleep well, which was not unusual following days that had contained a significant deviation from expected parameters. This was how he had trained himself to categorize unusual events, not as crises, not as problems, but as deviations, which was a word that implied the existence of a norm to deviate from, and therefore implied that the norm would eventually reassert itself. It was a useful mental architecture. It had gotten him through a perimeter breach on his 2nd month, a diplomatic incident involving a misunderstood hand gesture on his 5th, and the occasion on his 9th month when Kyra had decided that the best place to hide an injured Velhari tree crawler she had found in the garden was inside his security kit, where it had remained undiscovered for 2 days and had apparently eaten through the casing of his personal communicator, with what the palace veterinary staff later described as impressive commitment. He lay on his bunk in the joint security quarters and looked at the ceiling and thought about the receiving room and the carafe and the garden going blue outside the window, and decided that last night did not feel like a deviation. It felt like a hinge, something the story of his posting was turning on, whether he had agreed to that or not. Reyes from the other bunk said, "You're thinking loudly again." "I'm not making any noise." "You do a thing with your breathing," Reyes said, without opening his eyes. "When you're processing something, it gets very even, like a man trying to convince his own lungs to behave naturally, which obviously has the opposite effect." Ethan considered this. "That's very perceptive for someone who's asleep." "I'm not asleep. I've been awake since you came in at whatever hour that was doing your very even breathing." Reyes finally opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling alongside him. "The Queen talked to you." "Yes." "Was it bad?" Ethan thought about the almost laugh. The way she had said she is 6 asterisk with the weight of someone hearing a truth they had been technically aware of but not actually holding. The garden going violet and then back to blue. No, he said, it wasn't bad. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then, you know that when I took this posting I was told it would be primarily logistical, low engagement, routine security presence for diplomatic continuity. He paused. Nobody said anything about the heir to an alien throne using my bunkmate as an emotional support structure. She's 6, Ethan said. She needed somewhere to run. But she ran past 14 other people to get to you. I know. I counted, Reyes said. 14, I had time, I was busy not reacting. The cough was good. Thank you, Reyes said with genuine dignity. I thought so too. But he went to Kyra's room at the 7th hour, which was when the morning security rotation brought him past the residential wing anyway, and which meant that going to the door was not a deviation from his route, and therefore not a thing that required explaining to anyone, including himself. He expected to deliver the morning check to the attendant on duty and continue. He did not expect the door to be already open, and he did not expect to hear, from inside, the specific quality of silence that was not emptiness but the silence of people who were in the middle of something that had temporarily stopped producing sound. He looked through the open doorway. Selivra was sitting on the floor, not in a chair, not at the formal sitting table near the window, not in any of the positions that a room like this offered to a person of her stature. She was on the floor, back against the side of Kyra's sleeping platform, legs extended, still in the dark-fitted clothing from the night before with the addition of what appeared to be, on her left sleeve, a small smear of something that was the color Kyra's morning meal supplement usually was. The sole attendant in the room had positioned herself near the far wall with the expression of someone who had witnessed something they were going to spend considerable time deciding how to file. Selivra looked up when he appeared in the doorway. He looked back at her. For a moment they simply acknowledged the fact of each other across the room, and then she made the small hand gesture that meant proceed, which in this context apparently meant come in rather than speak, and he stepped across the threshold. She's at breakfast, Selivra said. She'll be back shortly. She looked at his expression. I came early. I wasn't, she stopped, reconstructed. I wanted to be here before the attendants arranged everything, before it became an occasion. That was the right instinct, Ethan said, and meant it simply, without architecture. He sat on the floor also, because there was no reasonable alternative that didn't involve him standing over her like a post, and because it was, as he had said the night before, a small thing that was not actually small. The floor was warmer than the hall's composite surface, some residential thermal property. The attendant near the wall made no visible reaction to a human palace guard sitting on the floor of the princess's room beside the queen of the Velhari, which suggested either profound professionalism or complete dissociation. Ethan respected both possibilities equally. They heard Kyra before they saw her, the particular footfall pattern of a child who was not running, but was moving with purpose, accompanied by the voice of a second attendant in the corridor saying something in Velhari that had the cadence of please slow down in any language. Then Kyra was in the doorway, still holding the edge of a small nutrition tablet she apparently hadn't finished, and she stopped. She looked at her mother on the floor. She looked at Ethan on the floor. She looked at her mother again with the expression of a person encountering a variable they had not included in their model of the situation. Why are you on the floor? She asked Selivra. Because it seemed like the correct place to be, Selivra said. Kyra considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. Then she came into the room and sat between them, close enough to her mother that their arms were touching, and finished her nutrition tablet with the focused efficiency of someone clearing an obligation before moving on to more interesting things. Am I in trouble? She asked, mouth still processing the last of the tablet. No, Selivra said. Ethan said that yesterday and then you talked to him for a very long time. We spoke, Selivra said. It was a different kind of conversation. What kind? Selivra was quiet for a moment. The kind where someone says something true and you need time to understand why you didn't know it yet. Kyra appeared to find this acceptable. She turned to Ethan. "Were you in trouble?" "I was in a receiving room with a carafe of something that tasted like electricity," he said, "so it could have gone either way." Kyra smiled, which was the specific smile she produced when she understood that a joke had been made, and appreciated it without necessarily understanding all of its dimensions. Then she turned back to her mother, and her face shifted into the focused look that meant she was preparing to ask something she had been thinking about since before she walked in. "What is the blade for?" she asked. "The real reason." Selivra did not deflect. She did not produce the formal answer. Ethan watched her decide in real time to give the child the version that was actually true. She talked for several minutes about the *Vereth* forms, about what they preserved, about why the Velhari kept the memory of old ways of fighting even when fighting had changed, about what it meant to her to stand in that circle and move through something her ancestors had moved through before her. She used words small enough for 6 years old and true enough for her own. Kyra listened with both eyes forward and her hands in her lap, which was her most attentive posture. When Selivra finished, Kyra sat with it for a moment. "I still don't like it," she said. "I know," Selivra said, "that's allowed." "But I understand it better," Kyra said, in the tone of someone making a concession that has cost them something. Then, apparently satisfied with the terms of this internal agreement, she leaned sideways and put her head against her mother's arm with the unconscious ease of someone going somewhere they have always been able to go and have simply forgotten was available. Selivra did not move. Something in the line of her went very still in a way that was completely different from the stillness she carried in the hall, not the stillness of control, but the stillness of someone holding something carefully because it matters. Ethan looked at the far wall and gave them the privacy of his attention being elsewhere. From the corridor came the sound of Ray's footsteps on the morning rotation, pausing outside the door, assessing the room with the brief silence of someone who had counted 14 people in a ceremonial hall and understood quickly what he was looking at. Then the footsteps continued. The morning security report would be filed, Ethan knew, as routine. Kyra, head still on her mother's arm, said, "Ethan." "Yes, I had a dream about a fish that could only talk in questions." "What kind of questions?" "Like, why is the water wet, and what do birds think about?" "Those are good questions," Ethan said. "The fish thought so," Kyra said seriously. "It was very proud of them." Selivra made the sound again, the almost laugh, the first syllable of something caught before it completed, and this time she did not check whether anyone had heard it. The morning light moved through the residential wing's filter panels and settled across the 3 of them on the floor, and the palace continued its vast and indifferent operation around this one warm, unhurried room. And the most powerful woman on Velhari Prime sat with her daughter's weight against her arm and said nothing, because nothing was exactly what the moment needed. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, she had nowhere else to be.